But for that period, it absolutely dominated the view. The idea that the verification basically said, principle basically tells you and says that that unless you can tie a sentence is only, or a sentence or a proposition is only meaningful if it can be tied to the physical world. So, or it's either a tautology, so it's something like, a bachelor is an unmarried male. That's what's called a tautological statement, because the word bachelor means unmarried male. So Ayer had asserted that the only meaningful classes of statements are those which are tautologies, or those which are expressing something that can be verified in the physical world. So you can go out into the world and confirm it in the world. If it can be confirmed in the world, then it's a meaningful statement. So that was a logical positivist theory of meaning, or the verification principle. And so the consequences of that is, if you think about it, is that can you go out into the world and find God? If you're, or any sort of metaphysical statement, by definition, the metaphysical statement is trying to describe reality for you. It's trying to tell you what is real, but in an a priori way. It's not related to nature at all. So the logical positivists basically said that all metaphysical statements are meaningless. Every single one of them. So all religious statements, all statements about God, anything that's trying to talk about beyond what we can verify by empirical methods and by logic and tautologies and logical systems, anything beyond that, any sort of a metaphysical view is false. You cannot state, if somebody, it's like, if Wittgenstein, I think, put it a little bit like this. He said, if somebody is in their propositions, in their signs, which basically means the right senses, is purporting to talk about something metaphysical, then one needs to point out to them that they've got no, some of those signs have got no referent, which is how we connect it to Frege, and Frege opened the door for this way of looking at the world. And so the logical positivists really took that idea on in there, made the verification principle not a doorway to mystical understanding of the world, which in a sense was what Wittgenstein's purpose for the Tractatus was to say there is the mystical. His conclusion was mystical, but they in a sense took it and said the only meaningful, only particulars exist. There's no universals, only particulars exist, and those particulars are the phenomena of the natural world, and unless we can relate stuff to the natural world, all discourse is meaningless. And that is the real, that represents you then understand, in a sense, that allows you to look at that period in many ways intellectually began with the work of Darwin, and this progressive secularization and naturalization of philosophy and of the way of looking at the world, until you end up with, in the 1930s, you had what was called, I think it's called the Wissenschaft or something, and it was like the scientific view of the world. So that was the Positivist manifesto. And then at the end of the 30s, you obviously got the first Humanist manifesto, and then we had sort of Nazism and Communism. I think all atheistic views of the world that deny all different expressions of atheism. And so the idea that somehow we separate our philosophy and our politics from religion or from theology or from metaphysics, we can see the consequence of that, in a sense, in what happened to the world when metaphysics was rejected, and you then had this vacuum filled by these what people called was science, because we have to remember that the Nazis were very scientific. Their view, they believed generally that they were representing some sort of scientific view and some sort of progress of the world. It's like if you dig into Nazi philosophy and they really did believe that theirs was a scientific program. The communists really believed that theirs was scientific socialism. You know, they weren't utopian socialism, they were scientific socialism. And so this unhooking from any type of metaphysical concepts, which was made possible because of this progress through the 19th century, and then into this logicism of Frege, and then the logical positivist view, and these all were different aspects of what are the consequences to philosophy when it becomes unhooked from any sort of metaphysical moorings. So I think I'll leave it there. But that key thing of that verification principle, I think in the next one we'll talk a bit more about that verification principle and why what Quine found was so wrong with it, because it's very even though it's remarkable to think that even though it dominated thought for dominated the academy between 20 or 30 years, absolutely, and in many ways modern naturalism, some of the flavour of modern naturalism really got its naturalistic science got its basic views and its temperament from logical positivism. So incredibly influential view, but that principle of something's only meaningful if you can attach it to the real world, and that you can verify it in some way with reference to the real world, that verification principle is a very powerful principle. You can see why it had such an appeal to people who were looking for a way of getting back to some sort of real way of being able to describe the world, not in idealistic terms, in mental, psychological terms but where you're dealing really with science and you're providing some sort of a philosophy that's far more scientific rather than speculative and amorphous and dense. We want something that's clear. That was the point of analytical philosophy, is that we're making things clear. Analysis, breaking things down, and then if we break them down into nice units, then eventually we can understand those. We then try and synthesize them back again. That was the original flow, the intention of analytical philosophy. And so, so it's like I'm an analytical philosopher, I'm an analyst. I break things down, try and understand things, and then try and synthesize stuff together. So I think, but that getting to that sort of like point of the verification principle, seeing how powerful it is, the obvious next step is to say, well, what's the problem with it? And it actually has got like a blatant, obvious problem. Now, there's been some very interesting work that's in some way that's been done on to try and give the verification principle a firmer foundation, because the problem of the interaction between mind, or what's called the mind-body problem, which bothered Descartes, which has been a real issue in philosophy very much since Descartes. How do you connect the mind and the body? If the body's matter, how do the mind and the mind's consciousness, how do these two interact? How is that? Because Descartes was a dualist, wasn't he? So then other people were monists, other people were atomists. But this idea of how can we connect mind and world? Very famous philosopher called McDowell, who wrote the book Mind and World. Still, this stay the same problem. How do we? What is our relation to the objects of reality? So the analysts, their desire, their passion was to return to, say, like a real world, a world of real objects. We're not stuck in some sort of idealistic world of Kant where we're generating the objects of reality. No, we're saying we're in contact somehow with the objects of reality. Okay, so I've overrun my episode time by 10 minutes there, but I think it's so much interesting content in there. So some of these things are developing much more detail. But if it's like if you were trying to, I'm not giving a lecture here. I'm trying to sort of introduce stuff and put words out there and say, right, these are things that I dig into in more detail. But there's a great book called by Glock on analytical philosophy, which I'll also put in the description. So because I think there's probably no better. I think it's a high level reference. It's great. It's a great book. Very thorough. My first supervisor recommended this book to me for analytical philosophy. It's an excellent book, so I'll put that in there just to get a feel of what the differences is. But in many ways, analytical philosophers are far more scientific. So you're very much interested in sort of like it naturally goes along with a scientific view in some sense. It's like a corollary to it. Quine's famous for describing when he talks about, because he views philosophy as part of science, as like on a continuum, that there's and that's one of the things I like about in Quine's philosophy, this sort of idea that it's on a continuum, that there's not this clear break between, say, science and philosophy, but because a lot of philosophers want to make a very clear distinction. They say that science, that philosophy becomes science when it firms up and it gets a theory, and he's very much talking about that philosophy is part of science, and so which is very part of his holism. It's called holism. So these are all that sort of stuff I really very much dig into, and I want to sort of probably do just a bit. I want to do another one on the verification principle. Hopefully that's like another episode in its own right, because there is it's very easy to see why. It's obvious really when you understand how and then the implications of that and what flowed out of that. Because I think when I was doing my high level review, I mentioned some of these things that flowed out of there, and if you get rid of verificationism as a principle in science, as a foundation for science, because most of the logical positivists really wanted to provide like a philosophical foundation for a new scientific view of reality. So when they called their manifesto the scientific view of the world, the reason why they were calling it the scientific view of the world was because they believed that science could solve the problems of the world. So can you see how there's this ethical dimension to this, which is one of the points I'm going to hammer home as much as I can, is that your philosophy is never divorced from the ethics of what you're doing with it. So these guys, lots of the positivists were signatories to the Humanist Manifesto. And what the Humanist Manifesto, it was concerned about the here and the now, of sorting out the problems of humanity by dealing with the here and the now, rather than talking about giving these grand metaphysical theories and these religious normative ways of behaving. We want to apply those that they were saying that's just a distraction from dealing with the main, how do we deal with the problems of humanity in the here and the now. So the Vision Geschlafter and the Humanist Manifesto, part of the same thing, part of that great movement within that, flowing out of Darwinism into communism, into what became Nazism. Then you had the sort of like the Italian take, the fascism. I think it was Mussolini himself who coined that term, fascism. But it was a variety of totalitarian, of the Nazi totalitarian view, and the anti-democratic sort of that flow that came through, as a reaction to the liberal democracies of the Victorian era, which were started to have their main big problems, and then people wanted to, the problem is we need to be more scientific, you had that scientific flow. And you then had that great, the great trauma both of the First World War and the Second World War, the Holocaust and what that said about the humanistic assumptions that man is basically good. How can you say that a man is basically good if you're then confronted with the Holocaust? It wasn't just a Jewish Holocaust. There was many, 6 million Jews that, died, but then you had another million who were, who you would call, they were disabled in some way, or they were Romani, the Romani in Europe, the nomadic sort of people. They were considered inferior people, right? There was all this sort of this very much this eugenic assumption underneath Nazism, which wasn't just something that was in Nazism. It was something that was within the intellectual elites of Europe. There was a very powerful eugenic move. In Britain, where I'm from, there was a strong anti-movement against the eugenic society. Was a society, and they petitioned against sending the strongest young men, who were the best breeding stock, off to war to be killed, because they said that's going to affect our nation. So it wasn't, and all the scandals that we've had with when the Australians, what happened to the Aboriginal peoples, the colonisers who didn't just affect, instead they didn't just they considered the Aboriginal people as an inferior. They considered people of underneath average intelligence inferior, and this happened you find all over the world this very strong, people tend to be very focused on the evil of the Nazis, when really that sort of science, and what we would now call pseudoscience, but those guys really believed that eugenics was a science, and they were giving expression to it in different ways. And so you see the importance of dealing with these issues in a holistic way. So as I didn't manage to cut myself off, I'll carry on for another 15 minutes, because I wanted to deal with the verification principle. So the verification principle says that unless we can verify, a statement is not considered meaningful unless we can verify it by empirical methods. It needs to be verifiable in theory in some way. There was the harder logical positivists who said, yes, that's absolutely, we will not say that a statement is meaningful unless we can do that. But then you have a problem with certain types of hypothetical scientific statements, and so the softer ones very much wanted to mitigate that in some way and say no, that's too strict as a view. So we're going to allow that in principle we can believe that this statement, so say you made the statement like the moon is green cheese, in principle that statement is verifiable, so it's considered a meaningful statement. Now it might be really, really difficult, particularly at that time, because nobody had managed to get out, get into orbit around the planet, but people said that in principle you could verify that statement. And so they were saying certain types of scientific statement are like that, or certain types of hypothetical statements in science. They would say that in order for science to progress, you have to admit that type of statement as a meaningful statement. And that is one of the big problems of the verification principle, is how do you provide a criteria that says that this statement, without being either too loose or too strict, how do you decide on what statements you are admissible as part of the verification principle. So that's one of the big problems of the verification principle, is the idea of criteria, is how do you assess. So the softer ones said, yes, we have to admit that statements like hypothetical statements like that, yes, we should be able to admit those in as meaningful statements. You then have a problem, as time went on a little bit more, you then had the problem with some, because they were saying that statements which express, because you have many uses of language which are expressing something meaningful, but you can't establish a referent for them. Like, when we were talking about Frege, we can't sort of like identify any sort of like objects, but they are meaningful statements. They are expressing something, and if you consider just poetry, for example, you can't say, for the logical positivists, when Wittgenstein tried to read poetry, I think he started to read poetry of, what was his name? Because Einstein was friends with this poet as well. But he decided to read some of his poetry at one of the Vienna circle meetings. And so it was clear that Wittgenstein was trying to say that their interpretation of the Tractatus was not what he was really getting at. And so when he started reading this poetry in this otherwise, the Vienna Circle tasked themselves with cleaning up philosophy, getting rid of all this metaphysical baggage and rubbish that had come into philosophy. We just want to clear it out, be clear with what you're saying, in a sense, taking that inspiration from Moore with this method. Be clear in what you're saying. If you can't express clearly what you're saying, then you're not expressing anything what you're saying. But also the verification principle of saying, so your first level of clear out is be clear in what you're saying, get rid of all the rubbish. Second level of clear out is saying, right, now analyse your statements. Say, are these verifiable in the world? If so, yes, that's a meaningful statement. Is it verifiable? But when he sort of like he tried to read his poetry, Carnap sort of snapped and said, just metaphysics, So you see that if you, believing in the verification principle, you're trying to push the verification principle, if you are then going to say that all the works of literature and of poetry and any type of artistic work of that, are you really going to say that it's meaningless? And so are you going to dismiss that entire? So the hard logical positivist said, yeah, absolutely. Now, softer logical positivist said, no. They wanted to say, no, okay, because that's an enormous, to just dismiss, art, literature, that anything using language in a non-scientific way, and to say that it's meaningless, that anything non-scientific is meaningless, it dehumanizes and reduces human experience beyond what most people would consider. There would, or if you're into music, or if you're into poetry, or you understand that those are such a valuable thing. If you imagine a life without music, or if you imagine a world without poetry, whether you consider poetry as narrative, or some dramas, all that sort of stuff, that's sort of part of that's part of what makes life meaningful. If you cull that out of life, suddenly you've got it was such an absurd consequence of the verification principle that the later verificationists started saying, okay, yes, we will say, well, this has got a motive meaning or subjective meaning, but it hasn't got cognitive meaning. In other words, it doesn't give you sort of like knowledge of the world or knowledge about the world. It's just expressing something about how you're feeling, and that of course, it's a massive reduction of human life, because often it's often the experience of art, the experience of music, the experience of talking to people, just enjoying people's company, thing of sitting, watching the sun go down, or watching the sun come up, or sitting on a mountain, or something. Those aren't meaningless, And so this sort of principle of meaning, it was totally sort of like untenable from a point of view of a holistic philosophy of life, and that was one of the things that Quine really zoomed in on, was the demand for sort of like for holism. Now, I don't want to get into Quine here and now, but his two, but his criticism of what he called dogmatic was this he called it sort of like of reductionism, of having to all logical or linguistic things to be meaningful had to have some connection to the physical world. So he said that was dogmatic, and that's where that is where I want the, if you like, the finishing thought as far as verificationism, because verificationism sort of says that the verification principle, it's now, first of all, it said it's the verification principle, and so it says that anything that's not is considered non-meaningful unless we can connect it to the physical world. So can I go out into the physical world and can I find a verification principle growing in the garden? Where am I getting this verification principle from? I am not referencing that principle. It's not got a referent in a real object of nature. Remember going back to Frege, what's giving it meaning? It's not. It's when we call it a principle, what we mean is that this is something that almost like a priori. By definition, this is a priori. This is not something a posteriori, which is connected with nature, that we're doing it after the fact. This is what we're assuming about reality. We're saying that our language is only meaningful if we are. If we're connecting it with the world, we are assuming that as a starting point. We're saying this, what we in fact are saying, are irony of ironies for the logical positivists who wanted to get rid of metaphysics in its entirety. If you read Neurath, he said that the only thing that can disappear without a trace is metaphysics. But that is a metaphysical principle. It's incoherent. You can't go out into nature and find a verification principle or a verific growing on a tree somewhere. This is something. This is what, to his credit, and maybe why he lost his influence within the empiricist movement. This is what Bertrand Russell actually realised. He actually said that you cannot justify empiricism on empirical grounds alone. When you're saying that knowledge, if you say that knowledge of the world comes from sense data only, that statement, knowledge of the world comes from sense data only, is not something that results from knowledge that is resulting from sense data. If you get this, you'll get if you get that, then you've got it, what I'm trying to actually communicate. And so the verification principle, which is a form of empiricism, the more rigorous, the logical positivists considered themselves the most rigorous, using the work of Frege, the foundation of Frege. They considered themselves the most rigorous. They were offering what they considered a scientific philosophy, a philosophy that also grounded science itself, and allowed for the progress of science. They considered themselves the most rigorous of all empiricists, but at the heart of their view is basically a metaphysical dogma. The verification itself, principle itself, is an expression of a metaphysical dogma, and that's what Quine goes after. He is considered to have utterly obliterated the movement when he published his two dogmas of empiricism, I think in 1957-58, and that's why I spend quite a lot of time on my thesis and obviously in the book, which is based on the thesis. I dig around. There's quite a lot of Quine that I dig around and look and what a bit more closely at the two dogmas, and what one obviously is reductionism, which is reducing everything in the world to having some sort of physical analogue. But he's basically saying that that's a metaphysical dogma. The paradox of the ironies of ironies is that logical positivism was based on a dogmatic foundation rather than what they were saying, which was like a scientific foundation. They just adopted a metaphysical dogma to generate their system.